our invitation for lecture. And good afternoon, everybody. And today with us, Professor Gautam Anand from IIST Sirpur, previously known as a Bengal Engineering College. And so he is going to talk about inverse. Just a minute. He is going to talk about inverse materials design through computation. So, Professor Gautam, please start your talk, please.
Thank you, Dr. Snehanshu Pal. Very warm good afternoon to everyone. I'm first of all thankful to Dr. Snehanshu Pal for inviting me, and I could see that many people are now joining. So I'm really glad to be talking in this particular faculty development program. This is my first time I'm talking in such programs, but I'm extremely excited, and I hope to share some of the things which we have been doing over here at IIT Shipur. In this particular pandemic, unfortunately, I couldn't visit NIT Rourkela physically, but I hope that I would be able to meet each and every one of you in a physical mode in the future. Now, first, let me share my screen, and I would be thankful if someone can tell me if they can see my screen.
Yes, we'll confirm, Professor.
So you can see my screen now? Yeah.
It's coming. Yes, we can see your screen. Please, thank you so much.
And can I use writing in between with the other screen also?
Yes. Yeah. Whatever you are comfortable, please, as per your content, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I have been told that in this particular program we have not only people from material science and metallurgy department, but there are people from other department also. And this is particularly a good opportunity for us also, because most of the time when we are talking about our work, we tend to be talking to people who are from our own area of expertise, and sometimes the interesting ideas of the work generally come from the outside. So I'm really glad that there are a lot of people over here who are from other departments also. And before I start, I mean, if any one of you feel like stopping me anywhere, you can just simply stop me. We have got ample time. Hopefully, we'll take a break in between, and then we will come back to our discussions. So stop me if you have confusion about anything. So before I start, let me start my discussion with a story. Okay, so let's go close to 100 or 160, 70 years ago. Most of the time, in this era of industrialization, when the industrialization was just starting, the design of material was not a concept. People were simply going, and they had learned with a very tedious and slow process to fabricate certain kind of material which they could use for application of their interest. And one of the most interesting material is, of course, steel. Now, people have been making steel for really long time using blast furnace and open hearth sources, where they first of all take the ore, and from that ore, what they do, they have some kind of process to make a pig iron out of it. So it has basically, from iron oxide, you are forming iron with a lot of impurities, and then they had a very slow process of making this steel out of it. But close to 100 to 160 years ago in Sheffield, there was this guy named Henry Clifton Sorby. Now, Henry Clifton Sorby is basically a geologist. So this fellow, and again, he is not a scientist. He's just a person who have inherited a lot of help from his father, he could have gone on in London and enjoyed his life, but he stayed on in Sheffield, which was in a way a industrial center in north of England. So this fellow, he got interested in microscopy, and he started to look into these. I mean, he's a geologist, so he's interested in various kinds of minerals, various kinds of associated processes. But people started to make fun of him, and there is a very nice quote of which he made in Fag End of His Life. Here he says, "In those early days, people laughed at me. They quoted Cézanne, who has said that it was not proper thing to examine mountains with microscope, and ridiculed my action in every way. Most luckily, I took no notice to them." You see, this is why in research it's very important that if we feel passionate about something and if we are reasonable, then we should stick on. And this is what this fellow did. He was studying rock formation and all these associated processes using microscope, and people were making fun. You have mountains, why you need to go and look into the microscope to study how these things happen? And with his background in microscopy, he started to apply he will etch these metals with acids, and he started to observe structures in the microscope. And this particular fellow, he initiated the whole area of microscopic metallurgy, where where he started to say that the failure of the material is somehow related with the microscopic entities which basically constitute a particular material. People knew that these, say, iron or whatever material or copper, whatever they're using, it's made of some kind of atom, but they did not knew that uh, they form some structures at mesoscale. So something in between is happening. And again, he's mentioning that in those early days, if railway accident has occurred, and I had suggested that the company should take up a rail and have it examined with a microscope, I should have been looked upon as a fit man, I mean, bad man, to send to asylum. But this is what people are doing. So this is a fellow who single-handedly started the whole branch of microscopic metallurgy. Now, at the same time, there was another fellow who was named Henry Bessemer, who was also interested in, who was very closely following this person, Henry Clifton Thorby, and in parallel, he started to work on a process to make steel from the pig iron in efficient and faster way, which would be cheaper to make, because earlier the iron used to be made out of from this open hearth process, which was very slow. But I'm not going to get into the detail of it, but as you could see that these two processes were going in parallel. Now, out of these things, basically scientific understanding about that the carbon in iron basically plays very crucial role. It basically increases the strength. So that knowledge was being developed through the work and work of these people and the work of Henry Bessemer. So the steel could be fabricated in large quantities. Now people, you see, this is where things starts to fall down. That's why I've named this the title of the story is From Discovery to Tragedy. Now, in early 1910s, you all have heard of a story of this thinking of Titanic in 1912. Now, later when people realized that they were making bigger and bigger ships, they thought that we can use high carbon steels or medium carbon. I mean, if I keep on increasing the carbon content in the steel, I could increase the strength and I should make big structures out of it. And that's what they did. The hull of Titanic was made out of this, where carbon was in certain regime, where interesting thing happens, where this ductile to brittle transition can take place if, because this ship was to go through Atlantic and the temperature goes sub-zero. So when this Titanic basically hit this iceberg, the hull of that, the material of that showed ductile to brittle transition, and that's why it failed. Because you see, ships tend to hit the iceberg quite often time, but nowadays they don't sink. Because now with this tragedy, we have an understanding that, I mean, you have to develop a holistic understanding about a material if you really want to apply a material in a challenging application. You see, this is what I want to emphasize from this story, that you start with some understanding which may be empirical, and then you try to develop various avenues associated with that information so that you can develop a holistic information about that particular material in application. Then only you can apply that material into area of your interest. This is where the concept of material design comes up into the picture. And this is something which we tend to study in our undergraduate, and we talk about this material science tetrahedron, where we say that there are four basic important considerations. Of course, one of this thing is the structure. What is the structure of the material? I will get into the detail of it, that what we mean by it, but what atomic structure this particular material basically exhibits, if it has certain composition. What is the method of processing you're going to use, and ultimately what property that particular materials exhibit, and can it provide the desired performance in a particular application of your interest. So these four parameters, you're always thinking about this in order to develop a thorough understanding about application of a particular material in area of our interest. Now, even if you are not, if you're not a metallurgist, if you're a computer scientist, you have to think all this in terms of these are various variables which you have, which are going to be playing a crucial role in ultimately the application of a particular material of our interest in a particular application. Now, traditionally, we tend to use characterization. So, by experimental means, we tend to we characterize the structure of the material. We tend to characterize or try to quantify what are the various variables which are playing very crucial role in a processing of a particular material. We tend to characterize the property and the performance of these materials traditionally by experimental means. Now, as I just have mentioned to you, that in most of these cases, experimental approaches work really well, and people have a tendency to follow hit and trial scheme, which is of course based on certain experience, to design newer kind of material for newer application. But this is a path where the challenges start to surface. Now, when we are talking about this structure, property, performance, this paradigm, the problem which we have in our hand is inherently multi-scale in nature. What do we mean by it being a multi-scale in nature? We simply mean that this material, the range of phenomena which are happening at various scales. And when we talk of this scale is varying at the space in the spatial dimension, and this is also varying in the temporal dimension. So the length and the time at which the phenomena which take place are very different. Now, if we start from this, our famous multi-scale diagram, you have these electrons, and one more important thing which we want to say, that if we want to really study this phenomena using computational schemes, there are going to be obvious limitations, and we will get into it as we develop our understanding about the multi-scale nature of the problem. Now, of course, if we want to study these electrons, which of course everything ultimately evolve out of the quantum mechanics based nature of the system. So you have electrons. If you are studying these electrons using quantum mechanics, then the scale which you're talking is somewhere close to 10 raised to power minus 12 meter, where you're talking about sub-angstrom levels, and at the same time, the electronic transitions which take place, they have they have a significant difference in comparison to what happens when you go to the next scale, which is the atomistic scale, where you can consider only atoms, and when you're basically not throwing out, you're basically coarse graining the full information of electrons interacting with nucleus into hard sphere models. In those cases, again, as you can see that the time scale and the temporal scale starts to vary. The point which I want to emphasize upon over here is that the mechanism which you might be studying over here and the physics which you require to study at this scale is going to be different what you study at the higher scales, which is the atomistic scale. The reason being very simple. It all boils down to the fact that what we can simulate at the present computer hardware level and what is the efficiency of the algorithms which we employ to study a phenomena of our interest. Now you can say that nowadays the computer hardware has shown significant improvement, and if you think so, you are quite right in saying so. But even with the present capabilities for the traditional schemes which we use for studying something for the electronic scale, you can at most study say few hundred atoms. You cannot, there are schemes by which you can maybe study few thousand atoms, but if, the technique which we are talking about, the traditional scheme, which we also know, which is also called the density functional theory. And I have seen the program, there is a discussion on this particular topic. So with the density functional theory, where you modify the quantum mechanics, I mean the Schrodinger equation to basically simulate, even in that kind of scenario where you want to simulate a many body situation where you have one electron which is surrounded by many electrons. It's also seeing electrons as well as the nucleus. So this is a kind of problem which people term as a many body problem. So in these kind of problems, if you can use density functional theory, but maybe you can simulate few hundred atoms, not more than that in general scheme. In that case, you have to go to a higher level, which is the atomistic scale. Now, generally, what happens that at this particular scale, people tend to employ the, I mean, they tend to fit the interaction between the atoms by various schemes. I'm not going into the detail how they fit these interactions, but imagine that these interactions are being fitted. I mean, generally, I mean, most conventionally, you run few of the DFT calculations, and from those DFT calculations, you try to develop your understanding about the atomic interaction uh, because imagine you have an iron atom. So now, if you have iron, I mean, if you want to simulate iron using the atomistic simulation schemes, classical simulation schemes, you want to develop the understanding about how these iron atoms basically interact with each other. Now you can run a lot of simulations, of course, small scale simulations using the density functional theory where with a limited number of atoms, and the information which you can gather at this density using this density functional theory calculations, you can use this information to fit the interactions between these two atoms. Now, this is the part where a lot of interesting things happen, because you see the information from this electronic or scale or the calculations which you have done with the DFT calculation, now you are transferring this information to a different scale. Now, this is a part where a lot of errors gradually starts to creep into the surface. And this is another interesting area of research where how you can basically quantify the errors and also how you can quantify the propagation of these errors as you move from one scale to another. I remember on the first day there was a lecture on this particular issue. So this is another interesting area. So once you have, going back to our original discussion, that once you have these interactions available to you by some certain fitting scheme, you can use that interactions to basically run the calculation at the atomistic scale, where you can maybe with the use of a good supercomputer, you can run few millions of atoms. And this is one of the very interesting area. Lot of information about the deformation behavior of material particularly can come out from these kind of, or no, other things also like diffusion and all. It depends on your area of interest, but basically the point is you would be capable of simulating large number of atoms to ultimately simulate lot of phenomena which takes place due to the movement of atoms, or the collective due to the collective dynamics of atoms. Now moving on to the next scale, which is basically the microstructural scale. It takes back up to our original story of Henry Clifton Sorby, where these people basically started to talk about this microstructure, and in metallurgy we tend to have a lot of discussion on this particular scale, because this is a part where people tend to cause a lot of change in the system by various processing schemes with the hope to generate various kind of microstructure, which is ultimately going to influence the property at the macro scale. Now, again, we need to talk about the way the information from the atomistic scale can again be passed on to various simulation schemes, which basically simulate the microstructures. And the phase field method is one of the classical example where people tend to take the data from these atomistic simulation to simulate range of microstructures. Now, the next question which we may ask ourselves, that whether this multi-scale problem is only present in the context of material science or metallurgy, not in other cases, but that's not the case. This multi-scale models are ubiquitous, and we tend to find it in a range of various areas of research. And one of the thing which I've shared with you is about the multi-scale models of medicine. And end of the day, where they have shown that range of phenomena can take place across the dimensional scale and across the temporal scale, where you ultimately start with basic chemistry, which forms molecule, which ultimately forms certain proteins, it forms cell, which ultimately tissue to organ, and ultimately towards the environment. So a lot of people who work in this area of multi-scale modeling, they apply the similar kind of algorithm. But when I say the similar kind of algorithm, I'm not talking about the individual components of the multi-scale model of a particular stream, but the challenging area is how you basically joins these various areas together to ultimately develop an holistic understanding about phenomena of your interest. And I can give you one more example. I mean, if some of you might be feeling slightly lost on the earlier parts, now there can be simple analogy. At least in signal analysis and all. Suppose you have a particular signal. I mean, now, we all know from our basic mathematics that from this signal can be, separated into various signal by well-known Fourier analysis-based schemes, where you can have range of various signals, which can basically again join together and form this particular signal. So this is a very simple analogy which I can give you, that the phenomena which we are seeing all around us is juxtaposition of various things which are happening in parallel. And when we have to develop a multi-scale model of our interest, it is our job to basically have some understanding about the various phenomena which might be taking place at various length scale and at various time scale. Now, in this case, it is very simple, because this particular signal can simply be separated into various signals, and again, if you join them together, you go back to this part. But the challenges in multi-scale modeling, and I'm going back to the concept of materials multi-scale modeling schemes. Lot of phenomena takes place at various scales, and the basic physics or basic understanding which is being used traditionally at these individual scales, they are being studied. They are being studied in an isolated manner, and this is what makes bringing everything together at one scale a difficult proposition. Now, we know what kind of challenges we have. We know that if we want to develop an understanding about, if we want to say design a particular material for a particular application, we have to start with certain material and we have to ultimately, with the structure, we have to go towards ultimately performance. Now, traditionally, what has been the approach? The approach is as follows, and it goes it goes back to late 90s, where Olson talked about this so-called deductive approach. Now, what happens in this particular approach? You process a particular material, you process it in ways, and then ultimately that processing condition basically influences the development of a particular microstructure. And from microstructure, ultimately, you can determine the property of the material, and that property is ultimately going to influence the performance of that particular material in a particular application. Olson called it a deductive approach because in this case, we are basically interested in cause and effect phenomenology, where we want to know the cause and we want to see how it ultimately affects the particular phenomena. Now, but in addition to that, he basically said that in engineering cases, we need to follow something which he called the inductive approach. So in that case, you have two things. First is a goal and another is a means. So say performance of a particular material in a particular case is your goal, and then you have to start thinking about these various means where all these parameters basically are becomes a part of the means to ultimately reach towards the goal. So in that case, the arrow of the understanding basically goes in the opposite direction. Okay, so this is what which we started with, but he was not yet using this concept of inverse material design, but now the similar concept which has been taken, and a lot of people are now calling this deductive approach to be I mean, when you are interested in cause-effect relations, the forward approach to the multi-scale modeling problems, but you can also start to thinking about the reverse approach, where you want to start with the answer first of all, that okay, I want my material to have so and so properties. Now what I need to do? So once you start from this particular direction, the challenge becomes different. You see, in the cause effect paradigm, when you're moving in a forward direction, it allows, in a way, a hit and trial approach to work very properly. But the moment you start with I mean, with certain goal, and if you have to come towards the process or even towards the design of a material itself, then the influence of computation becomes very important, because in that case you have to develop computer model or simulation schemes and efficient algorithms by which you can study the structure property correlations in the material in much more efficient way. Okay, so with this, let me start with a problem statement. Okay, so what kind of problem we as in material science generally face, and this not only for the material science. This kind of problem is an open area for people in the various streams of science and engineering, because uh, lot of understanding and sometimes lot of tools come from the people from other branch of engineering, particularly the computer science and engineering. So we start with the input. We have an input. We have certain elements, and I'm trying to show the direction of the so-called the forward direction, or the deductive approach with the rightwards arrow shown in red. So you start with, you have certain elements. You have one of the first thing which you want to know, that what kind of crystal structure, what kind of atom, I mean, what kind of configuration these atoms are going to exhibit. So that is the first problem. I mean, we are trying to basically separate the problems into the fundamental units. Then what kind of a microstructure ultimately this particular material is going to develop, and ultimately what is going to be the property of that candidate material, where lot of interactions might take place. Again, we talked about the multi-scale nature of the problem, so lot of phenomena might take place at the various scales. So that ultimately all of that will basically come together and ultimately gives you the final property of your interest. Say, if you're a mechanical engineer, you might be interested in knowing what is the strength of the particular material. Can I use this candidate material in, say, making a bridge or using it in a building? If you are an electronics engineer, you might be interested in the electronic property of the materials. So it depends upon case-to-case basis. That's why I have kept it generic. But now, what if we want to go in the opposite direction? We first look at the property of our interest, and then can we go back and say, can you, if you want to have so and so property, then you need particular elements first of all. So you are going back. You need so and so microstructure for that particular property. You need so and so crystal structure or for particular aggregation of atoms for that particular property. And to do that, you need this particular element. So in that case, the periodic table becomes your palette from where you basically picking up various elements and you start to do some interesting things out. Okay, so this is what is our problem statement. Of course, we will pick up few cases out of it, and then we will try to develop our understanding about the problem of interest gradually. Now, so suppose we start with a case study. We want to design a material. We are just discussing about the problem of writing. Except inspired by that, we just want to design a material which shows high strength and high elongation at low temperatures. When I say low temperature, it is, let's say, it's sub-zero temperature we are talking about. Now, if we are talking about something which might be happening at the sub-zero temperature, a simple, idea which I want to put people who are not from the material science, you see strength of the material and ability of that particular material to deform plastically, and I'm explaining it to you gradually what I mean plastically. These two properties generally are inversely related. So I was giving you the example of Titanic. They were putting carbon into the iron. So they're putting this iron is nicely sitting in a body center cubic structure, and they're putting carbon in the interstitial position. If you keep on increasing it, you will increase the strength of the material. So it will be difficult for you to deform, but at the same time, it will be difficult for you to deform, but you will not be able to deform it permanently. And this is what we mean by deforming a material plastically. So, of course, there are two kind of ways by which you can deform a material. You can deform a material by deforming it elastically. So if you apply very small amount of strain in the material, then the material tend to come back to its original shape or whatever configuration that particular material is in. So generally we call such kind of deformation to be the elastic deformation. I mean, the simple example is the elastic. You can think in that direction. But when you really want to form a material, you want to make shape out of a material, you need to deform that material. And in that case, this plasticity is important. Now coming back to our case study. Now, if you increase the strength and then there is a decrease in the plasticity of the material, there are ways by which you can increase both. But I'm not getting into detail at this stage. I'm just giving you a generic statement. So this is what we want. Now, we are starting with the property. So this is very clear to us that we want high strength and we would like to have high elongation in the particular material. I'm not giving you the exact value at this stage because we are just trying to develop our understanding about the problem. Okay, so we want to have high strength. Now, if I am thinking about this kind of thing, if I want to have a high strength and high elongation at low temperatures, what kind of structure I need to have? Of course, I'm talking about the both microstructures as well as the structure. I mean, the way these atoms are sitting at their lattice point. What kind of structures or what kind of lattice structure I need to have, as a matter of fact. So this is the second question which we might ask. And once we are clear about this particular question, we can also think about what is going to be my configurations of atom when they are sitting at a particular lattice point. So we are starting from the property and we're trying to come to ultimately what kind of atomic structure I need to have in my material of interest. Okay, so with this thing now clear in mind, let's take the in a very interesting material which is called the high entropy alloy. Now we are taking this material as a case study where we are going to play around with various schemes which we have developed and how ultimately, hopefully in the end, we will have some understanding that how ultimately we can progress towards our ultimate aim to have inverse material design a framework ready for us, which may be applied to other class of materials also. Now, this material of interest, of course, is where I've just shown a simple figure to you. It is basically high entropy alloys generally have a large number of atoms, particularly metallic atoms. There are other high entropy materials, but for the time being, let's concentrate on alloys. So you can have, say, 3 to maybe 5, 6 various, let's say, transition metals. And what happens that if you mix them together in a right proportion, then they tend to form, and of course, when I say right proportion, generally close to equiatomic composition, you tend to form very nice simple crystal structures. Say, I can give you an example. If I talk about say an element called cobalt, chromium, iron, and manganese, nickel. So you have a 5 element into it. If you mix them, if you melt and mix them together in a equiatomic composition, then you can form this nice face center cubic alloy. So you can imagine that generally when you increase the number of components into the system, and that was the understanding initially, that they tend to form I mean, intermetallics, or first of all, there can be a range of things which might happen. First of all, if you try to mix some elements together, they will not mix. They are immiscible. So those goes out of the question. If you mix, say, few elements, they will mix together up to certain compositions, and they remain in that particular crystal structure throughout. If you even change the temperature, okay. But there are certain material, if you increase the number of elements, there is a tendency for formation of intermetallic, and that was the initial understanding. But some people who were interested in some doing some risky work, they started to mix few elements together in equiatomic composition, and they they form single phase center cubic alloys. And this was interesting for a lot of people for various reasons. I can give you a few of the examples. Like these kind of materials are particularly applicable. You can have a very high fracture strength at the cryogenic temperature. Generally, there are materials which we use at a cryogenic temperature, and when I say cryogenic temperature, I mean that liquid nitrogen temperature. There are certain materials which can which are used generally, but these particular material have shown both increase in strength and increase in the fracture strength the elongation as you go to lower temperatures. So as you can see, you can straight see at this particular point that okay, there is a material, but this is just one material. What if I want to explore the other kind of materials? That is what is our aim. Now, you can also tune the magnetic properties associated with these materials. So the Curie temperature at which this particular material shows paramagnetic transition, that can also be changed. This material have shown good irradiation resistance property. So say if you want to use a particular material in a say fusion reactor which are coming about. Generally we use tungsten, but can this kind of material be employed? That's another area of interest. You can study exotic magnetic phenomena. Spin glass like structures are shown by some of these materials. You can also study, you can apply a lot of stress in these kind of material and study exotic face center cubic to hexagonal close structure transformation if you're interested in that kind of work. And not only this material is being used using the metallic material, but now people are applying this concept to oxides, nitrides, silicides, you name it. I just came across a paper where they are taking the C60, which is a Buckminster fullerene, our famous fullerene structure, and with a C70, and then they are mixing it in atomic composition. They show some interesting properties. So this concept is being another area. Of course, I was missing is catalysis, which is coming about. So you can use this kind of material for a lot of catalysis kind of applications. So in one slide I cannot do the justice with it. There are a lot of new interesting areas which are coming about now. So this is what we want to develop models for these kind of materials. Can you predict what crystal structure this particular material, if I have say six type of atoms, what kind of crystal structure they are going to have? Okay, that's the first question I can start think of. And if it has say certain crystal structure, how these atoms basically interacts with say a dislocation. So how the ultimately strength, the property of the material basically evolves. That can be another question. So we can basically explore a range of various questions. Okay, so with this motivation clear in our mind, let's first of all start with the first problem. Say the problem of, can I predict the crystal structure of an aggregate of atoms? So that is the first question we are asking ourselves. So in this context, we have developed a scheme which is basically you have, which is basically in hybrid genetic algorithm and molecular dynamics based scheme for predicting the field stability. Don't worry if you don't know much about it. I'm going to explain everything in detail to you. I'm just not going to show you the result. So in this first part, we use genetic algorithm for a particular application. Okay, and why we need that? Why we need molecular dynamics? For that, I need to share my another screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the part where we will be doing the writing. Now, in this, in the part which I've just shown you, in this part where you have a genetic algorithm part, and this is the part where you have a Monte Carlo part, and this is the part where you using statistical mechanics. So we have three parts, which is first is of course which is genetic algorithm part. Next part is the molecular dynamics part, and part was we're using some kind of statistical mechanics. Okay. So we should ask ourselves first, clearly we should be very clear that we are interested in predicting the crystal structure. So we are interested in knowing the crystal structure of aggregate of certain atoms. Let's say I have aggregate of A atoms, B atoms, C, D, E, etc. Now, generally, this is again a huge area of research which is called the crystal structure search. And generally, in computational chemistry, a lot of people have developed very interesting schemes for carrying out the crystal structure search, including the ab initio random structure search, or in certain cases USPSEX, if I'm not wrong, is another which is based on genetic algorithm, but they have their own application. In this particular part, we have to develop a newer method, because those methods have limitations, and maybe we will discuss about those limitations if some of you are interested. So this is what we want to know, that if we have these components, what kind of crystal structure they might assume. So let's say, can they assume FCC? Can they assume BCC? So just two crystal structure, candidate crystal structure we can think. Now, if I want to know these the properties of this candidate crystal structure, I need to know their thermodynamic properties. Okay. Now you all know that if I want to study about the thermodynamic properties, the first parameter which comes up into our mind is basically the free energy, or to be precise, which we call the Gibbs free energy. So for those who have no idea what that is, you see, okay, I'll come back to it. If you have confusion, you can stop me if I don't explain it in the later. So if you want to study the feasibility of a particular process, whether the particular process can take place or it cannot take place, generally these things are explained in terms of this parameter which is called the Gibbs free energy, and this Gibbs free energy can be simply represented in terms of this change in the enthalpy, and let me write it. So this Gibbs free energy change is associated with the enthalpy, and this is the change in the entropy. Okay. Now, if some of you who cannot understand that what basically from where these all parameters are coming, just bear with me. In the end of the day, all these parameters, be it enthalpy or be it entropy, and ultimately the free energy, they all ultimately comes from the energy. The system, if system have assumed certain configuration, it is going to have certain energy, and system can have range of configuration. You remember we talked about that these our interesting material or high entropy alloys are basically a material which might be having a very simple crystal structure. So suppose it may be simply a face center cubic lattice, maybe sitting on the face center cubic lattice, where these atoms might be sitting at the corner, and some of them might, and there's some on the face center. So have we done the 6? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, 1 more. So what happens in these alloys, that basically various elements, it can be either A, B, C, D, whatever, anyone can sit anywhere. That is why these kind of alloy system are also positionally, I mean, they're called disordered system. But mind it, don't confuse the glasses, they have their own problems. When we say disorder over here, we just mean that any atom can sit at any lattice points among these, say, these 5 elements. So ultimately, if you change the configuration, say over here, you had A, say blue represents A. Over here you had say B, or say over here you had C, and so on. You can color it, and you can basically understand the configuration. Suppose if this interchanges, then the energy associated with the system is ultimately going to change. Okay, so this is just this understanding you need to develop, and with the change of this understanding, with these energies, with the E, say E1 is one energy of one configuration, E2, and so on. Okay, so basically, if you change the configuration, ultimately you change the energies associated with it, and ultimately these energies decide this value of enthalpy and the value of entropy. In simple way, sometimes people tend to, generally, in our undergraduate, we tend to talk about this entropy as a measure of randomness, where we have analytical expression for this delta S in terms of number of ways in which we can basically put these atoms together in various form, and people an expression for that goes well back to the Boltzmann, where he developed this S is equal to basically, this is something which you tend to see a lot, is LNW, where this is the number of ways by which you can basically arrange these atoms on a lattice site. But there are other ways by which you can also progress towards entropy. Again, those are particularly difficult ways to basically calculate the entropy. But for the time being, if some of you just want to have a broad understanding, this is enough. So ultimately, these thermodynamic properties, you need to determine the Gibbs free energy, and if you can do it, then you are well and good, because you can calculate the minimum free energy associated with the atoms, if you know whichever of them have the minimum Gibbs free energy is going to be the most stable one. But mind it, to calculate that, you need to calculate the energies associated with the configuration. Now, keep that our broader picture clear in our mind. We are trying to develop an inverse framework. So whatever we are doing, we need to have an efficient scheme for doing various steps. So this is just step one. We are trying to determine the crystal structure associated with an aggregate of atoms. So that is all just step one. Now, I can also carry out this particular exercise of calculation of energies of various aggregates using ab initio based schemes. So you remember I showed you a graph. In that graph, let me go back. So in this graph, remember I showed you this one. Yeah. So I can do the ab initio calculations, but the problem is, if I want to carry out the ab initio calculations, generally, as I just mentioned to you, generally with the conventional scheme, I can simulate few hundred atoms. Even though in that case, I need a big supercomputers, and it's going to be computationally expensive. So that is the challenge which straight away which we have. That is why we move to the next scale. Can we use the fitted interatomic potentials to simulate these E values? Yes, we can. There are interatomic potentials available. We fitted our own interatomic potential initially, but let's not get into the detail how we did that. The point is, we have those rules available to us, which we can use to basically calculate these energies using the atomistic scheme, a classical simulation based scheme. But the challenge remains that how do we sample this? Now, how do we basically calculate these energies? There can be, if you have five, if you are good in combinatorics, you can say, if you have, say, 4 atoms, and suppose you have, say few thousand sites, equivalent sites, sorry, non-equivalent sites, where you can basically put these atoms, and if you randomly change the position, if you randomly change these atomic positions, you can do that. And this is what fundamentally is done in the context of ab initio random structure search based schemes, but they never deal with so many atoms which we are talking about. Because you see, you are dealing with the disordered alloys. When you are dealing with disordered alloys, there can be, there are so many positions where you can basically put the atoms. The combinatorial complexity is simply too large that you won't be able to simulate large number of aggregate of such atoms, because I'm just showing you one supercell. If you really want to simulate the disorder, then you have to simulate the larger supercell, because you don't want the atoms to be seeing it similar neighbors. Okay, so you don't want it to have a similar kind of neighbors. So you want it to have a different kind of neighbors associated with that particular atom. Okay, this is something which you hope to do. So you can do the random searching, and well and good, that can also be done. But the problem with that is how do you know that ultimately whatever the random sampling you are doing, you are basically some. That's the first time I'm using the term the sampling. The term is sampling. So sampling, I mean, in context of statistics, say if one is trying to get the data, so they also do the sampling. They go, say if one is interested in collection of data from the normal, I mean public, they go to various home and collect the data about a particular thing. So they randomly go at various places and they collect certain data. So they are also doing the sampling. Similarly, when we are saying we are randomly changing the positions of atom and then seeing what is the energy associated with it, we are basically carrying out the random sampling. But as I have just mentioned to you, if you want to do the random sampling, there is a possibility that you will not be able to sample the energy states which are crucial for the determining of the equilibrium thermodynamic properties associated with the material. Now, when I'm talking about the, when I'm talking about the equilibrium thermodynamic properties, be it Gibbs free energy we talked about, be it the enthalpy or be it entropy ultimately, and we will see how we can calculate the entropy out of okay, entropy out of these expressions. So if we want to calculate these terms can be calculated out from the energy which we can calculate by certain sampling schemes. So I'm just writing it. So if I'm just doing it randomly, so I can just change the atomic position. So if I let me go back to my scribbling. So basically, I'm changing these positions for say X number of lattice sites. So my supercell, say maybe have few thousand positions. So I can change those, and basically with each change, there will be change in the energies. We will get various energies. So you can basically calculate these energy terms, and ultimately say you carry out the sampling for the end stage, then you can use it to calculate these parameters, and I'll come back to it how we calculate it. But this is the first part which is important, that how we ultimately find these energy values, because the lower energy values are the one which are going to be playing very crucial role in the determining of and in the determination of the equilibrium thermodynamic parameters associated with a particular alloy. And that is a question, that is the challenge which we are starting with. So this is a part where the genetic algorithm comes up into the picture. We have developed the schemes for swapping the atomic position such that we do not miss the lower energy configurations which might be playing crucial role in the determination of the equilibrium thermodynamic parameters. And how we are calculating the energies? We are using the molecular dynamics. Now, I think you have been you have been part of the discussion on the molecular dynamics, how these calculations are done. So I'm not getting into the detail of that. But the point is, we are interested in determining the energies associated with these configuration, and the molecular dynamics basically basically it moves around the atom a bit so that the forces between these atoms are minimal, with the aim that we are basically sampling the low energy regions associated with the each atoms of our interest in this full supercell, which basically represent the disordered element. And then we can use a simple framework to determine the probabilities associated with the energy states. And from there, we can calculate one parameter I'm just mentioning is basically this is very close to something which is called the Shannon entropy. Calling it thermodynamic entropy would not be right because to really know the thermodynamic property, you need to sample all the energy states, and that is something which is a challenge. I mean, how would you sample trillions and trillions of atomic configurations? So that is another question for some another day. But this is a basic framework. Now, people who might not be knowing what the genetic algorithm is. Now, again, the genetic algorithm is a very simple and easy scheme, which again, as an optimization scheme, is a very strong framework, which is being used in a range of applications. But in this context, we are interested in studying the sampling. Now, when I say sampling, what we are basically going to do, we are going to basically change these positions of atom, and this is what we want to achieve out of this genetic algorithm based scheme. Now, the genetic algorithm is basically inspired by Darwin's natural theory of selection, where he basically says that you get these genetic information from your parents, and the best one only survives. So we are not getting into the detail of it. The point, there are three important things, only three important things at this stage which you need to remember. One is about the selection of parents. Second is about the crossover, how the information is exchanged, and lastly about the mutation which can take place. Okay, so these three concepts, if you know, then you will be able to make out what I'm doing in the later stage. Now, this Rayleigh wheel selection of wheel for parent selection is very important. In the context of our sampling, we wanted to sample the low energy states. And if you want to sample the low energy states, now if imagine this uh, this this wheel was divided equally into 5 parts, and I have got 5 candidates which can be the parents. If I'm choosing the parents, and if I rotate it, I mean I've just shown rotate it, and whichever stops with this near this spoke, I will say that that parent is selected. Then the probability of selection of any particular parent would have been, or in all the cases, it would have been equal. Okay, but in reality, it doesn't happen, because depending upon your problem of interest, you can vary this proportion in this wheel, and by doing so, you can basically change the probability associated with the selection of a particular case as a parent. Now, can anyone tell me which of the case is most probable is going to be selected if I just rotate it randomly? I mean, let's talk. I mean, if I keep on talking, it's not very interesting.
Somebody wants to interact? Please raise your hand. I hope they are only want to listen you. Okay, please.
Okay,
carry on.
Let's just talk then. Okay, so you can say that it is the A which is going to be more the probability associated with the A. So A is the one which is going to be possibly going to be selected. Okay, so that is, and you can, depending upon case to case basis, you can vary this proportion, and in the again, as I was telling, that in the context of selection of the parents, when we want to sample the low energy regions of the potential energy landscape, we would be interested in choosing the parents which have got the lower energy, and this is what we are going to keep in our mind. Now, the next concept which is important, once you have chosen the parent, the next part which you can do is about the crossover. So say if the information is black, or the left bar represents the information which you're getting from the parent 1, and the red bar represents the information which you might be getting from the parent 2. In that case, if there is a crossover, and I have just drawn it, I mean, it can be anywhere, it can be random. So if there is a crossover between these two parents, ultimately this information, this chunk is going to be transferred into this part, and this information is going to be transferred into this part. And this is what we see. Out of these parents, you have basically by crossover, you have generated two children. It is as simple as that. That you are uh, basically exchanging the information between these two parents to ultimately get the two children. And this is I mean, very broadly the way the information, genetic information, I mean, transfer take place in reality, in the nature. Now, but in addition to this crossover where the information is shared between the two cases, the two parents to generate I mean, children, there is also something which happens which is called the random change in the information. Now, this top one basically shows the binary bits. Suppose, I mean, I have encoded my information into binary bits, 1, 0, 1, 0, and so on. So this is a string of information which I might be having. There is a possibility that for no reason, some of the information might change. Like you would expect 1 to be here, but over here you have just 0, and over here you expect it to be 0, but 1. And this is totally random. Now, this random process of mutation is again very important in terms of generation of newer information in a pool of particular information through this genetic algorithm. This is again very important. So with this very basic understanding, we can now embark upon developing and sampling algorithm for this interesting class of material which are high entropy materials. So in this first part, let's first of all talk about what exactly we want to achieve. So initial part, these are my two parents. Again, in that case, these parents are being represented by the configurations of atom. Now I have just marked one of them red so that you can. So what I want that if there is a crossover between these two parents, this information I want over here. So say red atom at this particular lattice site, I expect that red atom to be there. I do not know what atom might be over there. I'm just representing red to represent the atom of my interest. It can be any atom. That's why I have not colored it. So this point should become a red. It's a kind of a coloring problem. And say over here I have a red. I want the information from this parent to transform to this particular part. So I have two parts, and I want the swap of the information to take. And if I want this to happen, but there is a constraint. And the constraint is very simple, that I don't want the composition of these supercells to change, because at this stage we have a distinct composition, and from that composition we want to see what are the various energy landscape the system can have. So we are at this stage we are not changing the composition of the system. Okay, so say you had equiatomic composition of A, B, C, D, E, 5 various elements. They are just present in I mean, in a disordered way. So there is no preferential position where these atoms are. With this, and ultimately, I want this to happen. That at this position, the red atom has arrived, and at this position, equivalent position, the red atom has arrived. But as you can see, there is associated change, and we will see how that associated change ultimately happens. So we want to start from this left, want to move to right. So how we basically carry out this process? So first of all, we encode the information in a particular way, where the one type of atoms are basically arranged like all the chromiums first of all, then all the cobalt and so on. I mean, in this case, say I'm representing the ternary or quaternaries. The basic simple thing which I'm doing over here is that these atoms are basically arranged in a way. I mean, all the atoms of a particular type are arranged in, on one part of the system. Of course, they can have different spatial coordinates. The information which we are going to swap is the identity of atom and the associated x, y, z coordinate associated with that. So say we start with a say random number I. Say the number of points, I mean number of lattice points could have be few thousand. From that particular number, say n, from 1 to n, I generate any number. So the first number is say I. So this I basically represents the same type of atom, which is a chromium at this location in this parent 1, while this represents the parent in parent 2, it represents this particular lattice site. Now, then once I have determined that, then I say that what is this particular atom which is there. So at this point, I had at ith position, I had chromium with a different spatial coordinate, and the spatial coordinate associated with this atom say was XA, YA, Z. Now, then I try to find what is the position of the spatial coordinate or this Cartesian coordinate in the parent 2, and say that is at position K, which is again represented over here, and maybe a different kind of atom is sitting over there, say the cobalt is there. Okay. Similarly, whatever the value which I have, spatial coordinate which I have at the ith position in the parent 2, I try to find it in the parent 1, which is there. And then once I have determined these positions, I basically swap the identity of these atoms. By doing so, you have now the green atom over here and the red atom over here, and the blue atom on this part is basically changing, and this is red is going over there. The point which I want to make over here is, with each swap, you have associated mutation. So you are changing the information, so crossover is taking place, and with that associated crossover, there is a change in the, there is an associated change in the identity of atom at somewhere else in the both parents, and by doing so, with each swap, there is one mutation. So by doing so, we are changing the information, and we are doing the crossover, and then we are causing the mutation to take place. Okay, so that is a very basic sampling algorithm which we do. But and as we run these kind of simulation, and we ran this simulation for at this case I can only show you 3 cases, which is a cobalt, chromium, iron, and nickel. Then if you add aluminium in 0.5 of that, and then you basically, when I say 0.5, we mean to say that it is, if they are in equiatomic composition, you have 20-20 each of it, and when you have a 6 component, then you divide it on into equal proportions, and if in this particular case, if it is half of the equiatomic composition. Okay, so we started with this. So this sampling algorithm, before we start this sampling algorithm, we carry out the random sampling to generate the initial population. So if I go back over here, so before generation of this parent part, we carry out the random simulations to generate a random population, and from that random population, from this particular random population, which I have not shown you over here, but I would like you to visualize that from this random population, I am choosing the minimum energy configuration, which are the parents, by this Rowley-Wheel parent selection scheme. And once I have selected these parents, then from these parents, these two parents are again chosen, and the swapping of the information associated mutation to generate 2 children. Two children take place. So say if you have 100 parents, out from these 100 parents, we generate 100 children. Okay. So I hope this part is clear to everyone, that how we have done, and this is what I wanted to show you, that this is the energy, in a way density of state kind of thing for the 3 cases I'm just showing you over here, that